Welcome to the virtual SWS conference. Thank you all for being here. I'm super excited about this book salon to showcase 4 amazing books. My name is Ophra Leyser-Whalen. I'm an associate professor of sociology at the University of Texas at El Paso, and I am just going to moderate. So you are not going to hear very much from me, but rather our 4 great authors. And I am going to go in the order that they were listed in the whatever you call that meeting conference thing. um, and so I am going to, can you all see my shared screen here? Great. I am going to read Piper's bio and actually, I'm going to read everyone's bios and show their book pages. And then we have several questions that SWS gave previously to the authors, and they'll discuss those questions. And then we'll leave time at the very end for Q&A for any of you. So before I start, does anyone have any comments or questions about anything? All right. Well, the first author is Piper Sledge, who's an assistant professor of sociology and the director of Gender and Sexuality Studies program at Bryn Mawr College. She's also affiliated with the Health Studies and Africana Studies programs. Her research and teaching interests include gender, race, and embodiment. Piper's current book project explores embodied experiences and institutional contexts of people who cross boundaries that undergird race and gender structures to understand how racial and gender ideologies are reproduced, resisted, and reimagined. So as you'll hear Piper talk about how cancer has gender structures. The next author is Katrina Kimport, who goes by the pronouns she, her, and she's a qualitative medical sociologist with the ANSWER program at the University of California, San Francisco. Her research focuses on gender, health, and reproduction. Dr. Kimport's research engages in 2 central themes: understanding people's personal and social experiences of abortion and contraception, and investigating the cultural negotiation of controversial social issues related to sexuality and health. So we will hear about No Real Choice, her newest and awesome book. The next author is Krystale E. Littlejohn, who's an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Oregon and author of Just Get on the Pill: The Uneven Burden of Reproductive Politics, which is UC Press 2021. Congrats, Krystale. She earned her PhD from Stanford University in 2013 and her BA from Occidental College in 2007. Her work examines race, gender, and reproduction, particularly at the nexus between embodiment and biomedical technologies. Her research has been published in Demography, Gender, and Society and Journal of Health and Social Behavior, among other outlets. She's received funding from the American Association of University Women, the Society of Family Planning Research Fund, and the ASA Minority Fellowship Program. Last but not least is Barbara Sutton, and I will also read the bio for your co-editor who couldn't be here. Barbara is a professor and chair of the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of Albany. She's the author of Bodies in Crisis, which was the winner of the Gloria Ansaldúa Book Prize by the National Women's Studies Association, and Surviving State Terror, which received honorable mentions for book awards by the ASA Sex and Gender section and the New England Council of Latin American Studies. Congrats. Her co-editor is Naila Luz Vacareza, who's an assistant researcher at the National Council for Scientific and Technical Research in Argentina. She teaches sociology courses at the University of Buenos Aires. Among other publications, she is co-editor of Affect, Gender, and Sexuality in Latin America, which came out in 2021 with co-editors Cecilia Macon and Marisela Solanas. So we have a really amazing bunch today. These are the questions that the authors were given previously by SWS. So they're each going to take about 5 minutes to cover these 4 topics. Authors, do you want this PowerPoint up, or can I take it down so we can see your lovely faces when you talk about it? Talk about these things. Does anyone? I can put the questions in the chat too if you need them.
I think so.
Okay, I will do that. Piper, are you comfortable to start?
Sure. So thanks for the introduction, and thanks everybody for joining us on Zoom. For those of us on the East Coast, it's the end of, a long week, I'm sure, for everyone. So thank you all for being here, and I'm really happy to share space with all of you and the other incredible scholars on the panel. So hopefully I'll get all of those questions answered in these remarks, but if I miss any, hopefully we'll have time to come back at the Q&A if there's anything missing. So I begin Bodies Unbound with the assertion that medicine has a gender problem. And this problem centers on the perpetuation of normative gender ideologies through the medical regulation of patient bodies and the challenges that gender expansive people experience when seeking medical care. So in the book, I explore the relationship between patient identities, gendered embodiment, and resistance to gendered ideologies of the body and regulation through an expansion of the concept of biolegitimacy to specifically account for gender. So this move allows for the consideration of how the meanings and value of gender may be reproduced or reimagined within daily life in the context of the locus of gender's biopower, which is the medical community. And so I weave this analysis of biolegitimacy with and through the stories of 57 people whose bodies and gender identities do not match the medical and cultural expectations for gynecological and breast cancer prevention and care. And I link together the experiences of transgender men seeking routine gynecological cancer screenings, cisgender men diagnosed with breast cancer, and cisgender women who request bilateral mastectomies and refuse breast reconstruction in favor of flat closures following a breast cancer or BRCA diagnosis. The folks who shared their stories all created gender trouble for medical professionals by being men in so-called women's medical spaces, by being women who refuse medical care predicated on an implicit ideal of breasted femininity. And together, these stories show how certain configurations of bodies and gender identities come to be understood as legitimate and intelligible through interactions with medical professionals, family members, friends, and strangers. And I intentionally focused on the experiences, embodiments, and understandings of patients as an active feminist and queer praxis. And my hope in doing this is so that medical providers come to learn from patients and to understand that patients have an intimate, somatic, effective knowledge of their bodies and lives that are just as viable, if not more so, than clinical knowledge in achieving health. So fundamentally, Bodies Unbound is a story about the intersection of gender and health. And it's about the meanings we associate with gender and health, the way we embody these meanings, and the ways that we acquiesce, resist, imagine possibilities, and otherwise participate in the processes of gendered ideologies as both patients and practitioners. So I think I'm under my 5 minutes. So hopefully that means if other folks are a little over, you've got some extra time. So thank you again for being here, everybody.
Thank you, Piper. I'm sure you'll get some questions later. Katrina, you're up.
This organization is pretty cruel because the only thing I want to do now is go read Piper's book. But I suppose I will instead do as I was assigned. So I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm especially delighted to have this opportunity to talk about my new book. In brief, my book starts from the question, why would someone consider but not obtain an abortion? And certainly all kinds of decision-making are complicated, but particularly around abortion in the United States, the stigmatization of abortion and the seemingly ever-increasing raft of restrictions on abortion care suggests that maybe there's something else happening other than individual preferences when it's coming to who's actually obtaining an abortion. To put it another way, we have a strong public discourse, and I would argue it emerges in research as well, that pregnancy decision-making is about options, about choosing between terminating and continuing a pregnancy. But what if that isn't actually the question that all pregnant people are asking? What if cultural and policy-related barriers to abortion transform the question into, can I choose abortion for this pregnancy given the constraints I face? So in the book, I draw on interviews with 58 pregnant women, all identified as women, in Louisiana, which is a state with a high number of restrictions and low service availability, and Maryland, which is a state with fewer restrictions. I guess we have to say few restrictions, there still are some, and high service availability. And one of the sort of novel pieces about study methodology is that I recruited from prenatal care, piggybacking on a parallel quantitative study that asked everybody who presented for their first prenatal care appointment whether they had considered abortion for this pregnancy, even for 1 second. Those who said yes were invited to participate in an interview. And so I had access to a population that we don't otherwise usually know how to find. And most of these women turned out identified as Black, and all were financially struggling. So the project didn't set out to center this population, but these characteristics and their intersections were fundamental to the analysis. So few of the women I interviewed, I learned, had been able to take concrete steps towards obtaining an abortion, let alone make it to an abortion provider. And so in sharing their accounts, I make the case for how structures, anti-abortion cultural narratives, and medical mistrust rooted in the ongoing legacy of anti-Black racism can render abortion what I call unchoosable. Yes, Word will always flag that as not in the dictionary. But by this, I mean that abortion becomes effectively impossible to choose. And all of this is taking place while Roe is ostensibly the law of the land. So most of the women I interviewed, in other words, were continuing their pregnancies because they could not choose abortion, not because they wanted to have a baby. And each of the constraints on their ability to choose abortion operates as at the intersection of gender, race, and class. So I'll give a few examples in terms of structural barriers to abortion. I illustrate how it's not only policies restricting abortion, but also how these policies leverage other structures, such as poverty, to produce abortion as unchoosable. A prohibition like the Federal Hyde Amendment on public insurance coverage of abortion only has power because the people who rely on public insurance typically do not have other funds that they can use to self-pay for abortion. For anti-abortion cultural narratives, such as constructing the meaning of abortion as of killing or as a failure to be sexually responsible, their power to make abortion unchoosable builds on racist constructions of Black women as immoral, as sexually irresponsible, and leverages individual women's desire to reject these racist constructions. These narratives also individualize the need for abortion, erasing society's underinvestment in low-income Black women. So I find not only an absence of abortion supportive narrative in these women's lives, but also the absence of narratives that affirm the right of low-income women of color to parent. And I argue that these findings reveal a broad misunderstanding of reproductive decision-making, particularly for Black women who are struggling financially. And I want to delve just for a moment within my short 5 minutes to be more clear about what my overarching concern is. So I don't know, and I am not in any way invested in whether these women would have chosen abortion had it been a real choice. I'm sure some of them would have. I do not know that all of them would have. And certainly it is upsetting that they could not have an abortion if they wanted one. But there's another level of upset that the book invites readers to think about that precedes that material experience. That regardless of whether these women would have chosen abortion, they were precluded from being able to really consider it. And in so doing, they were also prevented from choosing the circumstances under which they wanted to have a baby, such as their partner, their financial circumstances, where they live. So their lack of choice meant not only an inability to choose abortion, but also had consequences for their ability to choose when and how to be a parent. So in this way, my book, I argue, illustrates the importance of a reproductive justice framework that not only attends to people's right not to become parents, but also the right to parent and to parent the children they have in safe and sustainable communities. So my book aims to convey the lived experiences of the women I interviewed, rendering their stories as they understand them in a sociological framework that recognizes how context, including structures, culture, and history, enable and constrain their decision-making. I'll leave it at that, and I'm really excited to hear the fellow panelists talk about.
Thanks, everybody. Great to see everybody here and great to be on the panel with my colleagues. So my book, Just Get on the Pill, is about sex, birth control, and inequality. It examines how we gender birth control as a society and how people who can get pregnant are socialized to accept primary responsibility for making sure that a pregnancy doesn't happen. The book draws on just over 100 interviews with young women in the San Francisco Bay Area to show how gender socialization in pregnancy prevention works and how what I call gendered compulsory birth control operates. So just as a quick aside, I talk about how women are socialized to see condoms as being a man's method and to see prescription birth control as being a woman's method. And all of the women in my study were cis women. And via that kind of socialization, they were then taught to not interact with condoms and instead to make sure that they got prescription birth control, and ultimately to make sure that they then did everything they could to prevent pregnancy without our society then also holding their partners accountable, which is why I call it a gendered compulsory birth control system, right? We hold women and people get cis women and people get pregnant to the standard of making sure a pregnancy doesn't happen, and we don't have the same accountability on their partners who are involved in that process. So the book is primarily concerned with the intersections of race, gender, and class, and with challenging biological determinism as an explanation for the gender division of labor and birth control. Through analyzing women's narratives, I show how the dominant approach to pregnancy prevention, which supports gendered compulsory birth control, pathologizes the behaviors of Black and low-income women who are less likely to prioritize using prescription birth control over condoms in their relationships. Ultimately, I show that gendering birth control isn't natural, but it is in fact unjust. Using a Black feminist epistemology was an explicit part of the project from its inception, and it allowed me to challenge the taken for granted ideas about the origin of gender inequality in birth control. In doing so, it also then allowed me to uncover the racist, classist, and sexist ideas that undergird social thinking about marginalized women's behaviors and about the behaviors of women who are trying to prevent pregnancy in general. So I'll go ahead and I'm going to stop there so we can have as much time as possible to discuss everybody's work. But I appreciate everybody being here and look forward to being able to talk more about our work in the Q&A. Thanks, everybody.
Hi, everyone. It's so good to see you. I see some black boxes also, but I know you're there. I'm very honored to be in this space. My book that I co-edited with Naila Luz-Bacareza is an edited volume, and it presents critical analysis about abortion politics in Latin America's Southern Cone. We think that it also offers lessons of wider significance, insights that may be useful to other places, particularly at a time in which we are seeing pronounced moves to restrict abortion, including in places such as the United States. And we asked the question about what is the connection between abortion rights and democracy not just as a system of government, but also as a means of promoting social justice. And to do this, we also draw on the history of military dictatorships in various parts of Latin America to explore how abortion rights demand fit in contemporary agendas, democratic agendas. So we focus on Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay to examine this complex reality of abortion, through the examination of the discourses, the strategies, the successes, the challenges of abortion rights movements. And we were able to gather a multiplicity of voices and experiences, which together illuminate key dimensions of abortion rights struggles. You will find here like, address like health aspects or litigation efforts, legislative debates, party politics, digital strategies, grassroots mobilization, movement, counter-movement dynamics, coalition building efforts, and also artistic and affective components of the movements. And the book also sheds light on social inequalities and transnational aspects of abortion rights struggles, and it reaches different scales of analysis, from abortion experiences at the micro level of the home or the clinic to the more macro socio-political and cultural forces that shape individual lives. And it does, gender is a very important component in the analysis, because we are talking also about the gender dimensions of these restrictions, these activisms, these struggles surrounding abortion. And one aspect also to highlight is that while women have been at the center of many of these struggles in multiple areas of social life, movements have also had vigorous debate about, not assuming that cis women are the only subjects of abortion. And in the book also, some of the contributors show how LGBTQ struggles have shaped the way abortion rights are framed and are advocated for in these countries at the time. And for example, in Argentina, many activists no longer assume that, that abortion just pertains to cis women, but refer to other persons who may become pregnant and need an abortion, such as trans men or non-binary or gender-conforming folks who do not identify as women and are part of the struggles and should be also considered, that abortion matters. So these are some of the things that that have been in the discussions of movements, and we think in this way that abortion is interesting to think about injustice in terms of how it is linked also to citizenship and how rights are structured in supposedly democratic contexts. Ultimately, we can think about abortion as a conduit to also think about gender and democracy. And in terms of intersections, this is a matter that does intersect issues of gender, sexuality, class, race, ethnicity, citizenship, disability status, among others. And in the region, it's common to hear arguments that emphasize how poor, low-income women are the most harmed by abortion restrictions, more likely to be criminalized, to undergo risky abortion procedures or not having access at all, while women with greater economic resources can have abortions in better conditions, even if in clandestine situations. These are we know also that these intersections also is not just about class or gender, but we see other vectors of inequality. And of course, here in the US, the framework of reproductive justice is about making this case to analyze abortion in a much more expansive way, accounting for all these different inequalities, and also just putting abortion in a broader framework of reproductive issues, right? And non-reproductive. So in Latin America, and also we see these varied experiences of oppression that have also shaped abortion understandings, and different collectives have questions and trouble and push to transform abortion politics. And I can talk later, maybe during the Q&A, about how feminist practice informed the approach to the project.
Thank you all. And yes, Tracy, I will put their slides up during the later, and you can get those discount codes. I know all the books seem so interesting, right? So SWS also has these extra questions. I will start posting them also in the chat. I know Katrina wanted to answer number 5. That doesn't mean the other authors can't. So Katrina or anyone else, can you tell us about some of the decisions you had to make regarding methods, and if your lens as a feminist sociologist guided any of these decisions?
Well, thank you. Very spontaneously, I will now answer that question. So part of the reason I wanted to answer this question is actually to bring up, especially in this space, a part of my methods experience that I found I had to really look for resources to support me in. So the interviews were really emotionally intense for me in conducting for this study. And part of this is certainly related to that. It was on the sensitive topic of abortion. And part of it was that the interviews ranged into so many other sensitive topics, and I didn't know what was coming sometimes, right? So I'm talking about discussion of physical, mental, and sexual violence, alcohol and drug use and disorders, suicide attempts, children being removed from people and placed in, severing of parental rights. I mean, it's been a few years and I'm actually starting to feel some of that emotional reaction even now. And so in the course of conducting these interviews, and so there are 58 that are included in the book, and then there were some methodological reasons at the beginning for casting a wider net. We weren't sure that people would disclose that they considered abortion, so we used some other metrics that we thought might capture people who considered abortion but didn't want to disclose that in a quantitative setting, and then we'd interview them. And so I ended up doing 83 interviews total. And this is not something that I necessarily saw as a term in the literature, but it's what kind of resonated to me was that hitting kind of emotional saturation. I felt depleted by the interviews. I was having trouble sometimes managing my emotions during the interviews. They were on the phone, which I think was important actually in terms of trying to not inconvenience and inappropriately ask the person I'm interviewing to support me, right? That's felt very, very inappropriate. Also it was just a bad thing to experience for myself. And so, it's not something that I went into the project thinking a lot about. But as I, continued to do the interviews, I mean, at one point I had an interview scheduled and I didn't feel prepared to conduct it. And so I called the interview at E as scheduled, and I told her I didn't need her for the study, but that I would like to get her contact information to mail her the gift card because I couldn't do it. So what I wanted to sort of bring up in this space is that kind of aspect of research and the way that I would love to see more feminist sociological attention to that piece of conducting research. And while I'm talking now about sort of the conducting and data collection, I also felt it at different points in, the analysis feeling a responsibility toward people, which can be kind of overwhelming to be a steward for their stories. And I will, for anybody else who's interested in thinking this through or experiencing themselves, I will recommend the work by Virginia Dixon Swift and team. They're an Australian research group, and they've done some work related to the sort of emotional pieces of qualitative data collection. I think they call it sensitive subjects. And anyway, so that was sort of the thing that that I think, my training as a feminist sociologist prepared me okay. And I wish that I also had some more thinking about what those emotional components and I mean, in some ways, a more sort of researcher hat for managing that itself. And I think that's an area that is not always in the forefront when we're discussing about research.
Thank you so much for that, Katrina. I think that your comments about also thinking through the analysis and kind of how to be a steward for your participant stories really resonated with me in my own experience around my own subjectivity with the data and how to talk about that in the book and how to deal with it and whether I should deal with it, and kind of wearing my mixed methodologist hat. So in my quant work, right, that's guided by a framework which as feminists we know is unfounded, but guided by this framework that's, you know, it's objective and we're testing hypotheses. And then we have the qualitative work where it's like, we know, right, that we're all coming to it with our own lenses. But in the previous work that I had done for my articles, I didn't put myself, right? I didn't insert myself into the discussion of the participant stories. Whereas when it came to the book, there was this tension around, I talk about being knowing that I'm a gatekeeper of knowledge as a person who's writing this book and who's interpreting the quotes and sharing it with readers. And so I had this really challenging time trying to figure out how do I do justice to their narratives without also suggesting that their experiences aren't like mine, or that my life isn't touched by the same things that they're talking about in their interviews. And so I ended up, this is kind of where my positionality as a Black woman was really important to me. And in the process of writing the book and kind of grappling with reviewer comments, I ended up going and putting more of my own story into the book, which ended up being really important. It was kind of nerve-wracking because my book is about birth control, right? And so it's kind of nerve-wracking to think about putting my own story into the book. I think in chapter 2, I talk about my experience getting an IUD, and I'm really explicit about what I remember of that experience. And that was just kind of getting to what Katrina was mentioning. That was I didn't necessarily go into writing the book thinking that would be something that I shared. And in the back of my mind, you know, I was thinking, how are people who are going to be reading this later, like, what are they going to be thinking about this? Is there going to be concern about whether or not it was appropriate for me to do it? And at the end, I just decided this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to go for it. And that is the kind of research that's kind of the way I wanted to do my research. And I felt that it was particularly important as part of my Black feminist epistemology to do that. And so methodologically, it wasn't only about making the decisions around how to handle the data in terms of the study design, but as Katrina's mentioning, my feminist analysis and my feminist standpoint was really important in making decisions about how I wrote the book and how I made space for my own experience there, and especially for how I made clear that I'm not immune to the gendered forces that operate in our society, right? I'm writing a book about this, but as a sociologist, I wasn't immune to it, right? I talk about how my experience could be understood as gendered compulsory birth control. And I only realized that literally through writing the book and then saying, hey, I think that's actually consistent with like this process that I'm writing about. And I just didn't realize before. And so that ended up being really, really important to me. Thanks for that segue, Katrina.
You know, these two answers to this question, right? They both, I think that this is the beauty of feminist research, right? Is breaking down this barrier between the objective social scientists pretending that we have no connection or investment in the project, right? I started my book project because I don't like going to the doctor and I wanted to understand why, right? So there's these personal journeys that we go on when we write, and that's part of this sort of like the sort of feminist praxis, right? But then there's this other aspect of the emotional aspect, right? We're trained to think about research as like this disembodied, unemotional thing, right? And the first time that somebody burst into tears in an interview because they were finally talking about something for the first time and trying to figure out what to do, right? It was so, you know, the weight of that, of holding that space for another person kind of hit, right? This is not what we're trained to do when we take our qualitative methods classes in graduate school, right? This is not part of it, right? It's about keeping your distance and not disclosing too much. But we're still human. And I think that's the thing that's so important about sort of doing research in a different way than most of us are taught. And maybe that's changing a bit as more more feminist, queer, Black feminist, Indigenous feminist scholars are the ones teaching the methods courses, right? But I think the other piece about letting ourselves be in it and having the feelings is that I know for me, I followed the stories, right? I set up the rigorous comparative case study that I was supposed to do for a dissertation. But what actually happened was following the stories and letting the stories lead the way, right? And having an IRB proposal that said I would interview these people in these categories and this, that, and the other thing. But then when other people found out about the study, we're like, we want to tell our stories. Nobody else is listening to us. There's nowhere else to tell our stories. Will you listen? Right? And so we listen. And I think I wouldn't be surprised if for a lot of us, our research journey kind of took a different path than we set out, right? Than we expected, partially because of this investment in the people and in the stories, and sort of letting our hearts guide us in a certain respect, rather than the sort of perfectly cerebral, disconnected scientific approach.
Can I add something to that? Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. And actually, I was thinking, this is not like from this particular book, but from my previous book, Surviving State Terror, this issue that you're bringing up, Katrina, was really, that I also felt that I was ill prepared. That, I didn't think I was naive when I went into that research, which dealt with testimonies of women who had survived torture and being basically, kidnapped by the state in clandestine detention centers. And even though I had not done, the interviews myself, that they were video recorded, oral testimonies, I found so many times myself like crying in front of the camera, just like, completely, having bodily symptoms myself. Like people, it was during my sabbatical, people were asking me, oh, are you feeling renewed, refreshed? And I was like, no, I'm completely, traumatized. I mean, it was a very difficult sabbatical, and one piece that I did find helpful, that I can put it on the chat, is a piece by Kimberly Thaydon, an anthropologist. I found it now. It's called "How Was Your Trip? Self-Care for Researchers Working and Writing on Violence." So even though also she deals with issues of violence, I think that a lot of these reflections can apply for, more broadly for, like you were bringing up, Katrina. And I was thinking now, coming back more to this book, I think in this case, like the way, things that are not like just strictly scholarly came up for us, is like it had to do also with our commitment to accompany the movements that are fighting for reproductive justice, for abortion rights, for feminist social justice. And it was really, a book that was the product also of transnational feminist solidarity, collaboration, and friendship, like trying to bridge, north-south divides, connecting academic and activist interests. And maybe we will continue conversations, but one thing that I wanted to bring up is also, this commitment to accompany the movement. Like, for example, when we sent our book to production, in Argentina legalized abortion, and basically, when we had written the book, it was illegal, right? So we, it was just like that moment, like, what do we do? Like, well, we will have to rewrite parts, like this cannot just be sent like that. And not just because, as a matter of updating, it's like because you want to be, with the movement. You want to be where you want to be part of that. I mean, I'm using the universal you, whatever I, or we, the authors, wanted to be part of that. So there were like things also that intervene in the process that, again, that were not just like from an academic or strictly academic standpoint, but from thinking from a feminist, political, and activist perspective of how, what goes into the book and how we conceptualize the book and how we write the book and how we publish it.
Thank you. I mean, that was very intense, but very needed. Does anyone want to add to that before we move on to the next question?
I'll say one last thing, which is a sort of a thought I've been trying to formulate or flesh out for a few years now. But there is, I guess what I would say is that some of what I think we each brought up is kind of making a case for the importance of using different modalities for qualitative data collection, right? And so being able to do a phone interview meant that, to I think a greater extent, my emotional processing was less visible to the person I was interviewing. And I know there's also a standard that sort of says in-person's always best, or now Zoom is best. And I do think there's something worth thinking through, maybe particularly around sensitive topics or some sensitive topics or some populations where there actually can be a really affirmative case for methodologically doing a phone interview or something that has that isn't in the in-person model. It's not inherently worse and may have affordances that are good.
That's just bringing up questions, but I know it's not my time to ask questions. So,
and I gotta just say one more thing too,
yeah.
just like based on what Katrina is saying, also, just like I think, one aspect also that you will find in abortion and democracy is like the variety of methods. Like there's ethnographic fieldwork, there's archival research, media analysis, authors could use statistical information, visual analysis, historical comparative approaches, qualitative interviews. And I think that, that adds to the wealth of also in terms of the different vantage points that emerge, but also in showing, how feminist research can be done in a variety of ways. So just that.
Thank you. Okay, I'm putting the next question in the chat, which is, writing a book can be an exciting and challenging process. What practices helped you complete this work?
I can jump in and start on that one. I have to say that I found the process of writing my first book incredibly overwhelming in ways that I just wasn't, maybe you just can't prepare for it until you're kind of in it. And so one of the things that was really important for me was writing in community. Before I started writing my book, I didn't have any problem being isolated as an academic, and I enjoyed the kind of alone time to do my own work and do my own thinking. But when it came time to writing my book, and I was just having so much resistance from the very beginning. I think when I was first kind of developing ideas, that was exciting to me. But then once I had to start trying to put words to those ideas, that part became incredibly hard, and I just experienced so much resistance to it. And so on those days, it was just really hard to be in my office doing the work. And obviously this was pre-pandemic. And so I found myself I love writing in coffee shops generally, but I wrote in a coffee shop much more often for longer periods of time. And then that led me to discover a co-working space and what's known as co-working, where you kind of rent a desk they called hot desk, so you can just kind of switch around and you're not kind of having to pay as much for your own office. And so I worked in a co-working space, and there were entrepreneurs and creative folks and people from all kinds of walks of life. And that ended up being really important for my book, because I talked to people that I wouldn't have ever interacted with before. And I remember talking with a person who was in marketing once, and he asked me what my book was about. And he's like, what title are you thinking? And I told him the title, and he literally was just like, you should talk to a marketer about that. You should talk to a marketer about that title. And at the time, I was like, well, it's academia, like these are our titles. But as I started getting deeper into thinking about the audience for the book, I realized that there was something really important to be said about making sure that my title was just as accessible as I tried to make the rest of the book. And so the co-working space ended up being important for me, not just to have that sense of community that I needed to get me through those hard days when I really just kind of wanted to crawl into my bed and not do the work, but instead I was around these people and their energy, and knowing that they were working kind of pushed me to keep doing my work too. And so just I'm bringing up, like, I'm talking about the co-working space as what was important for me, but the key was to have other people that I was writing around. And so I ended up having multiple accountability groups where we were just supportive with each other, and we kind of would sit and write together. And then my two last just quick points. I really focused on drafting for quantity and not for quality. So I just completely turned my screen off, and I would just type to get stuff out there, because the perfectionism was just making it so hard for me to make progress on the book. And that then contributed to the sense of overwhelm and to me not wanting to continue to work. And then the last thing, talking about feminist approaches, was a wonderful therapist. I had a wonderful therapist that really helped me deal with all of the psychological junk that comes up that people don't talk about. When I heard about writing a book, right, it's like, oh, it can be hard, you're going to hate it. But nobody talked about like how much self-doubt apparently comes up for lots of people, and can you do this, and is this important, and kind of having to push through that. So I'd already had a therapist, but then the book became like a thing that wasn't just my personal just not my professional writing project, but also became a personal project that I used to work through all of the different psychological stuff that came up while I was writing the book. So I'll stop there.
I was thinking when you were asking about like challenging processes, and I was thinking, we did this book during 2020, right? And to say that this was eventful year, it's really an understatement. Just to recap, there was the global spread of COVID and exacerbation of inequalities and economic crisis and political upheaval and all sorts of disruptions. I mean, this was the context in which we had like authors all over, the hemisphere, like contributing to this project, from their places and from in very disorienting, very changing situations. So that was part of the challenge of doing an edited volume and getting everybody together in more than one language, to push forward and to be motivated and to to have the energy when everything else seems to be collapsing, right? But I think we were all I can't remember now how many authors we are. I don't know if we are 18 authors or something like that. I think partly was like this commitment, like what I was saying before, that we see like not just as an academic project, but also about how, not just about documenting, but also perhaps from this place having some impact in a conversation, in a debate, and so like for us as editors, part of the challenge was to be empathetic to what everybody was going through, but at the same time to try to encourage, sometimes like gentle nudges, or provide like an organized work structure, to have like clear communication guidelines, to try to help also to assist when different authors were they had their times, or they had like their challenges. So flexibility with that too, but at the same time like strategically moving then forward with other parts of the project, and then also as co-editors, Naila and I, like we are friends, so it was it's based also on a relationship of trust and mutual respect, and trying to divide the labor equitably to the extent possible, like each bring our own skills and challenges. And I think that this understanding was also important, not just for the sake of the project to have a successful book, but for a friendship, because you don't want like a book project to ruin your friendship either, right? So, I think it was important like for everybody to be kind of on the same page, and at the same time, with understanding the different situations that everybody was facing. And then also, there was the matter of translation too, which added like a lot of more work. And in this case, to me, who was relatively more fluent in English, even though you can hear my accent still after all this year. But I do write books in English and such. And so, but there was this interest also from authors. I mean, there's no like scarcity of books about abortion in Argentina, Chile, or Uruguay in Spanish. But there was also and academics there too, like read stuff in English, right? Like productions from the global north. A lot of authors like become acquainted with those works. But I think like here in the US, many people may be less aware of a lot of the struggles and the things that are happening there. So that was also part of the impetus of publishing, bringing those perspectives and putting them in English for an English-speaking audience too. But it was, it does add a lot more work to do that too. But anyway.
I want to kind of echo something that Krystale said, this idea of working in coffee shops. So the thing that was most important for me, and also this kind of collaborative workspaces kind of things, the most important thing for me was getting away from my day-to-day, right? So writing retreats or finding a coffee shop where I could, put in noise canceling headphones and listen to like some kind of thinky music or whatever. But aside from like those spaces, I think, and things like finding people to write with or to read the work and that kind of stuff, there was something that was really important about taking a break, right? So for me, this was a dissertation to book project. So taking a year and just saying, I'm not going to think about this thing, like just giving myself full permission to say, it's going to sit over there. I'm going to do some other things. I'm going to think about some other stuff. I'm going to start planning other projects. Let me go back to it with a different perspective, right? And then the other piece is that we're all inundated with social media, with lots of tips and tools about how to write better, right? How to write more words or be more productive or get more publications out. And the other thing I gave myself permission to do was to not pay attention to those things and to trust that in all of these years of going through jobs in school and all this other stuff, that I actually know how I write, and that sometimes there are tips that I can absorb, but that it's okay to just be real and know that I don't multitask well. So all of the tips that say write 15 minutes a day, I can't shift gears that quickly, right? I need the whole day to just go in deep, right? And being okay with that. And I think there's these self-doubts, right? And these imposter syndrome and all this kind of stuff, because we don't let ourselves believe in ourselves, right? And we all got to this place. We can all do it, but it's okay to sort of do it in our own way. It's a little bit more difficult if you're collaborating with people, right? Co-editors, co-authors, that's a different sort of deal. But I think we get really caught up in all of the supposed to's rather than I just know how I work, right? And for me, when I started my PhD program, my oldest kid had just turned 1. And my second child was born while I was doing interviews, while I was conducting interviews. So these when I was transcribing, there would be moments where, you'd hear baby voice pop up because a nap had been interrupted or whatever. But it meant, right, but all of those things, right, we don't talk about the rest of our lives in terms of the writing process, right? And so we sometimes have to fit writing in at strange times of day, or, you know, in the hours when kids go to school, or when there aren't certain kinds of caretaking responsibilities, and all of that is part of it. And so that's another way of, like, all of these tips we get don't necessarily fit our lives, let alone the ways that we know that we work best. So those are the kinds of things I was thinking about in this sort of, like, how did we do it? We just gotta be okay with the needs that we have. But I really do recommend getting out of the usual places. That seems to be a good way to get rid of some distractions, at least.
So the thing I'll add, and I'm definitely you can make 15 minutes work, and I like to be in my office, and I like coffee shops don't work for me, so it works. Everybody has their own thing. But one of the things I want to highlight that hasn't been mentioned yet is that I always made sure to leave myself breadcrumbs for the next time I would be able to sit down. Because that was the worst, like when I felt like I didn't want to sit down because I didn't know what I needed to do next. So, you know, if there is that interruption, because I wrote a lot of this during the pandemic, so there were no coffee shops to go to anyway, and 2 kids doing Zoom school at home. And so it was like, so I got very good at being really clear to myself what I needed to do next. And so leave myself breadcrumbs to, I mean, the drafts looked like disasters, right? And I would do it in bold. So I would just, like, if I could hear there was a need, it would be like, yeah, because that's where they were. I would, like, suddenly turn to bold, and I'd be like, this is what I wanted to try and say. And then I'd walk away, you know, because you can usually take 10 seconds for whatever emergency is in the other room. But I think the breadcrumbs was really clear, because then I could trust myself that when I came back, I could find a little bit where I was. And that helped a lot when you're thinking about something that's like a really big project. How do you get into that space? How do you wrap your head around it?
Can I add something, Ophra? You know, I think, like, another challenge to me, like, for a lot of these topics, which relates a little bit to what I was saying before about what happened, you know, like with the legalization of abortion, which is actually something that to me was incredible that it actually happened at, you know, that moment, you know, like in terms of the timing of the book, it was, you know, where, you know, it didn't mean that we had to, you know, rewrite things and such, but I guess, like, more generally, for a lot of the topics that, you know, feminist scholars, you know, address, that are, you know, that are of a political nature, and also, like, with politics, like, you know, not just that the personal is political, but in terms of what's happening in politics, in, you know, in the public sphere, like in terms of the policies and things like that, and the, you know, and the political climates, and how things change so rapidly, and how that doesn't coincide with the timing of publication, right? Particularly for books. So, you know, how to keep up, and how to write something that I think I can't remember where I read it, but you know, this idea of writing something that is timely and evergreen, right? Like that, even as you are addressing the urgent matters of the day, and that you're speaking to those issues, but then, you know, it will have relevance also, you know, 5 years down the line or more, or that people, you know, that there are insights, there are things there that are important beyond the very particular position of those times, right? So to me, that's one of the challenges, and that's one of the things that I always, you know, it's in my mind, like also to take perspective, even as I'm immersed in, you know, whatever the things that are happening in the moment that may be exciting or maybe disturbing, or but also just to imagine, you know, a reader in the future, you know, how to make it relevant that way. So that's something, but it's not, to me, it is a challenge. I'm not saying I have, you know, I have perfected the art of the timely and evergreen, but it is something that it is in my mind.
So we have half an hour left. And so even though we're supposed to give 20 minutes to Q&A for everyone, how do you all feel about opening up for Q&A? Because I really do want to see, I think you've all said such thought-provoking things that I want to see what questions and comments come up from the audience. That's all right. Great. Why don't we, go ahead and jump in, or if you want to raise your hand and be formal, I can call on you. But while you're jumping in, maybe I can start showing those slides of the discount codes too that Tracy and I'm sure other people wanted. So does someone want to start with a question?
I'll ask one. Hi, thank y'all. And I think this puts Katrina and Barbara on the spot most. And it's purely a selfish question, to be clear. You've both written multiple books. And I think you talked about this a tiny bit, but like, I'm curious about thinking, yeah, second book versus like dissertation to book. Like you already have a thing that was like the thing, like a draft of sorts, right? A long way away, but it's different than like the starting from scratch without the, yeah. So I'm just curious for any things that are most important for you in thinking about it, and also additional like lessons learned or differences between the first time around and second time around regarding writing texts. Although obviously you can't predict everything because like pandemic, closing coffee shops, really not a thing you can, but like maybe there were other things, I don't know. So
I'll jump in. So I'd say that one of the differences is that my editor was like, okay, sure, that sounds good, right? Whereas like there was a more hands-on experience, it felt like, for my previous book, and because it was I was an untested author. And so there was, I got to do, I think, a lot more hand waving because I stayed with the same press. So I felt like I got to do a lot more hand waving of kind of like, it'll be fine. Like you can invest in this, in me, and I think it'll be fine. So I'd say that part was different. I think also, like, just as a process, going from dissertation to book, and I made some really dramatic changes and reorganizations and a lot of that. And it was also, the first time I was trying to do all that. So I think that in some ways, just having more experience as a scholar, maybe less than it being from a dissertation to a book, and more just having more experience in writing and communicating. And I think I did a better data collection because I have more practice. So all of those, I think, it's hard to isolate what might be the sort of different pieces. I'd say probably for my Queering Marriage book, there were more pieces I felt attached to because I remembered how hard I worked on them. And I had a lot less concern with this book. It was like, oh, it's not working. It shouldn't be there. I don't want to lose the audience. I don't want to lose, I just had a different clarity, I guess. And also feelings that, like, if it doesn't have a home here, I can find another home for it. I don't think I had that confidence in thinking about the book that came out of my dissertation. But Zakia, please write another book because I know you have lots of great things to say.
I mean, I think, in some ways, I feel like opposite, in the sense that for, the dissertation, I felt like, I had 5 people on my committee, like 5 fantastic feminist scholars. So that gave me a whole lot of confidence, that I felt like also like those chapters had been presented like multiple times, drafts and more drafts, and And you know, at the University of Oregon, which is where I did my PhD, we had this feminist, you know, group, and you know, we share ideas. And I felt like when I became a professor, it was harder than to actually share your, you know, just to get your work, like to get feedback, to that you feel like you may be imposing on people if you are sharing a draft. So you know, I always offer reciprocity, of course, and it has been like my second like solo author book. Also, I mean, I told you a little bit about, you know, some of the emotional components of that, but you know, I was feeling extremely pressured to like that. Because of the topic and the responsibility I felt towards, you know, the women whose stories I was also addressing in the book, that I felt, you know, I tried as much as possible as share it, you know, again, in the context of writing groups or friends or, you know, trusted people. But I think that otherwise you can, I mean, I myself, I find it hard, you know, and it makes me feel insecure when I'm not, if I'm just on my own on this. I need to be in dialogue with other people. And during I'm actually writing another book right now on a different topic, which is also like a solo author book, and which I was doing also during this time of pandemic. And I found the SWS writing groups very helpful, and I gave also I shared that idea with other organizations and other people, and actually I have now like a writing group with scholars and activists in Argentina, which came from the SWS idea. So I was just popping in and out of writing groups, and I think, you know, that for what I'm doing now, like that was really essential, because especially in the context of pandemic and not even being at the university, just the sheer isolation, I find it like very difficult, you know, in terms of progressing with my work and getting my ideas also.
Someone asked, yeah.
Can I ask, can Barbara talk about the book she's working on, or is it a secret?
It's not a secret, but it has nothing to do with abortion. It's called Fashion of Fear, and it is about bulletproof fashion. You know, it deals with issues of security and gun violence, and I don't know, it just it doesn't have anything to do really with reproductive justice issues, but it does have to do with issues of bodies and embodiment and emotions, and security, broadly defined.
Oh, that sounds amazing. I have a student in one of my classes that whatever the topic is, he sees fashion in it. He would be very excited to hear that. So.
Yeah, so bulletproof fashion, for those of you who may not be familiar, you know, there are all these products that are, you know, like backpacks and jackets and things that are bulletproof, but they're actually for civilians. They don't look like bulletproof, and so they are, you know, in the context of mass shootings and things like that, they have been promoted.
I had a question. Well, I mean, I have several questions, but I'll just ask one, not take up too much space. But, you know, Katrina and everyone, you were talking about how emotional it can be to do interviews on emotional topics. And, you know, I confronted that several times, starting with my dissertation work. And I remember one time I came home and told my spouse, this is the first time someone I interviewed didn't cry. Like, it was just so shocking to me. But one thing that I was wondering, because, you know, sometimes when the person was crying, I mean, I would show emotion, right? Because we're not robots, we're human beings. And I didn't want emotional support from my interviewee, but I also didn't feel bad about showing emotion, because I felt like it was something feminist to do, to connect with that person, to show them that I'm understanding what they're going through. And so I'm wondering, you know, how that plays into the idea of what you were saying about not letting the person see the emotion via phone versus really connecting with that person on an emotional level.
I think there's a difference between being a human and connecting to somebody who is expressing emotion and what I was finding happening to me, which is somebody was reporting something to me that they didn't. I mean, the one that really comes to mind is somebody who, she did the interview while she was shopping in Walmart because she told me that she didn't. Anyway, that was when she was available, and that was what she wanted to be doing. And so literally in the transcript, there's a part where it's like, where's the pine sol? Where is the pine sol? And I still don't know who she was asking that of, whether I was supposed to answer or it was just a rhetorical. In any case, she was in Walmart, she was shopping, and she was telling me things about her life that I found very, very upsetting to hear. And in some ways I found upsetting because to her, and the way that she was conveying them to me was almost well, she was not conveying a set of emotions about it. She was reporting it to me. And so thinking about my position as a white, you know, fully employed, highly educated person who's sitting in a comfortable office, who and listening to somebody, you know, talking to somebody who has a very different social location, I did not want to be applying my emotional response or suggesting in any way that that was an appropriate or better response, or put her in a position of needing to say, no, it's okay, right? Like, because that's not what we were there for, right? Like, this was not, so I think that there is a difference between being responsive and, you know, in other places, you know, back to our sort of the straw man robot interviewer, which nobody can be and nobody should aspire to be. You know, there were plenty of times in an interview where I would clarify, you know, I'd stop and say, I just want to tell you your emotions are welcome and I don't judge them. And, you know, we would sort of break whatever, I don't think you call the fourth wall in an interview, but, you know, I talk about that. And, you know, I would be really clear about, I don't think that sounds like a bad choice. It's, you know, it sounds to me like you made a choice that felt good to you at the time. And I don't see why I need, you know, so I would offer those sorts of connections. And I think that that's absolutely important and central to conducting feminist methodology. And I think that is, though, distinct from having an emotional response that's not consistent with what the other person is expressing. And I don't know how they felt. I don't know whether they had worked through it and could simply report it, or this was a sort of a way of protecting or coping in communicating. But I certainly didn't need this person to feel like she was supposed to react a certain way. I mean, especially when I'm imagining her walking through the Walmart in search of pine sol, right? So, so I think that's kind of what I want to get at. But I absolutely agree that, like, the value of welcoming and validating emotions, but I don't want my emotions to intrude on how the other person is describing their life.
You know, another aspect that I was thinking too is that emotions also emerge, you know, when you're conducting research, you know, that includes people who maybe, like, so far, you know, from, for example, your political perspectives, or and I, you know, the same way too that Katrina, you were saying earlier, like, well, you know, I you know, I didn't quite have all the tools, but I mean, I don't know, that's how I heard it, at least, to deal emotionally with this. I have felt that to, you know, when, you know, just interviewing people, I mean, in in different projects, including, for example, people who supported torture or who were just, had political views, who were just so that I was, it was just so far apart from, emotionally also far apart from where I stood, that it was really difficult to conduct the project, not because I have to agree with everybody or that you can only do research with people you empathize or just, but I think that there's something also to be said about that, about the difficulties of I don't know, just like when the positions are really just, I was finding them like so difficult to accept, or like someone who, for example, just to be concrete, like who supports torture would say that waterboarding or whatever, so what about those aspects too? I don't know, if you'll have, I mean, I have had most of my research has been also like with activists or with people, even if I didn't agree in everything, I felt all closer. But I did also did research that was that was not necessarily the case, that it was hard to even like sustain the space. It was just like writing or something, like, because it was hard to sometimes to make eye contact or things like that.
And I think Roberta had a question in the chat, so I'll keep my comments brief. I just wanted to add, just in case anybody else has anything to add, I just wanted to say that I kind of understood what Katrina was saying as making sure that we're locating, that we're always being mindful of what the participant needs and how the participant is experiencing things. And so even as I think part of being feminist researchers is recognizing that we're all going to have different responses as individual people to challenging circumstances, right? So anybody who's read my public writing knows I write openly about lots of trauma that I've experienced in my life. And so if you were to assume that I'm going to have a cheery response to something that I'm talking about, right, that wouldn't be consistent with my experience, because I can talk about lots of traumatic experiences with no emotion whatsoever, and lots of my participants could talk about traumatic experiences with no emotion whatsoever. And so in mirroring my participants and kind of showing them that I'm with them and I'm seeing what they're trying to communicate with me in the way that they're trying to communicate with me, I think for me, it was important to demonstrate that I saw them and I understood what they were saying, and that I was always being mindful of what they wanted in that moment to the extent that I could know, right? So if a participant wasn't crying, then I could understand, right, where Katrina's coming from in terms of being mindful of, is my experience going to make them feel like they then need to be taking care of me, versus just recounting an experience as a mundane everyday experience as they're walking through a Walmart, right? And so I think the feminist lens for me is saying, what does this participant need from me? And am I doing my best to give them that experience? And recognizing that we're all going to have different experiences as researchers. And I think it's important just to be mindful of what we need as researchers and what we can do as researchers, and then being careful to try and make sure that we're not then imposing some of our needs on what our participants are going through. And I think that's kind of the way that I understood what you were saying, Katrina, and kind of the distinction I see between what Katrina was talking about and kind of the question that you were asking, Ophra, about how to connect, right? If a participant is crying and crying feels like a natural or appropriate response for you as the interviewer, so I understand that, right? It might make the participant feel like you're connecting with them. But if the participant isn't crying, I can also understand why you would say, you know what, this isn't about my feelings. This is about the participant and what they're going through. And so I'm going to withhold to the extent that you can, withhold that, or as Katrina was talking about, feel a little bit kind of challenged with trying to figure out how to manage that, and then being grateful that phone is an option so that you could manage that experience. Thanks for that point, Katrina, and thanks for that question, Ophra.
Thank you. Also remember during this Q&A, authors, you can feel free to ask each other questions. We have 8 more minutes.
I have a question. I love the conversation. I feel like saying so many things, but I want to go back to your work, to the book, since you opened by giving us this mini synopsis of what the book is about. Maybe it would be really nice to, I don't know if to end, but to have also your version of what would be the main, lessons or main highlighted, conclusions of your work. And what else, right? What else was next, or what would you like to have been able to include or add to it? But there's always that point that you have to just send that out, and move on. And thank you so much for this. Is so inspiring. Thank you.
I can hop in and go first. So I would say the kind of main takeaway point for me is that differences in technology don't explain gender inequality in birth control. And instead we come up with explanations that attribute biology, or that say that biology is the reason for gender inequality in terms of women and people who get pregnant being responsible for preventing pregnancies and carrying that primary responsibility. My work shows that it can't just boil down to that, right? There are lots of reasons why it doesn't make sense to say this is happening this way because methods for female bodies are just the most effective, right? My work challenges that. I think moving forward, and also not only does it challenge that, it shows us the ways that we pathologize marginalized women's experiences because we buy into that narrative instead of recognizing we are contributing to gender inequality, and we're reifying gender in the process of thinking about technologies in the way that we do. I think in terms of what I want to do next, I'm really interested in studying couples and how couples understand the risk around pregnancy, to better understand how they think about conception, how they navigate birth control in their relationships, and to really challenge the risk paradigm that we believe operates in the literature that I just don't think is consistent with people's actual experiences in terms of how they think about pregnancy and the chance of getting pregnant.
I can go next. I think, one thing about the book is that really the highlighting both the institutional and non-institutional strategies and that are needed, like to make change when it comes, for example, for abortion politics. And I think the book nicely illustrates all this multi-level, multi-pronged, ways of interventions, like from the grassroots to lobbying in Congress to litigation in the courts, and the importance also of changing the discourse at the everyday level to bring these conversations to whether it's the social media, but also just to people's homes to have these conversations, and the success of the movements, I think. And how they have moved now, in a direction, opposite to what's happening here in some ways, has demanded that persistence and tenacity, and have, activists, coalition building and having those difficult conversations, and operating at all these multiple levels, and just the long-term, struggles that, that these are not things that happen, it can take 15 years, 20 years, decades, right, for these things to happen. But I think to me that has been one of the most exciting parts of the project, just to see, all these different ways of intervening to create change. And I think in terms of my next project, especially in Argentina, I'm interested now that the legislation change, how's going to be, implemented, where the movement is going also, and how not to leave it at, abortion, but how this connects to broader feminist struggles. So.
I'll go next and give Piper the last word. I think the main takeaway from my book is that abortion can be unchoosable even when it's legal. And so if we want to understand abortion and more broadly choice around a pregnancy outcome, it's not just about restrictive policy. I know this is a real counter narrative when right now what's happening is all this attention on like Texas's SB 8 and Dobbs, but I think that that is a narrow focus that doesn't understand the full context and experience. In terms of what I'm interested in doing next is I'm really interested in thinking that bridges out of this project is thinking more about medical mistreatment and medical mistrust and the way that that overlaps with abortion, which is kind of a weird overlap since abortion is broadly separate from the traditional healthcare system. And so understanding more about that production and the consequences.
So really the key takeaway from my book is that the medical community sort of tells all of us that the way that medical care proceeds is through evidence-based medicine and patient-centered care. And what the stories in my book show is that that's actually not true. And that there's lots of moments where there isn't evidence, right? There isn't clinical research. There isn't a standard of care. And even when there is, what's actually happening is that medicine is working really hard to make sure that bodies and gender identities line up in particular kinds of ways. And that especially when there isn't a standard of care or clinical evidence, that's the fallback, right? If providers don't know what to do, they fall back on, well, the best thing we can do for a patient is to make sure their bodies and gender identities line up in normative ways. And things get very quickly messy when patients push back on that. And then the next book is to keep engaging with biolegitimacy and the relationship between how and why certain bodies have biolegitimacy and ideas of social intelligibility, right? And legibility, right? Who can we see? Who is legible and visible in society and in social interactions based on these ideas of biolegitimacy? And so I'm looking at this sort of historical and contemporary cases of trans folks' experiences and mixed race folks' experiences as folks who are inside and outside of these systems and have embodiments that don't quite line up the way that these normative structures expect them to expect us to.
Thank you all so much. I'm looking forward to all your next writing. And thank you so much for sharing with us today. Thank you to those who came. It's nice to see you all. I'm sure that I don't know how the authors feel, but you know, if you're open to people emailing you additional questions, if they have them, maybe you can let us know. Otherwise, thank you so much. I will leave the Zoom open if anyone wants any last minute things, but I hope to see you all in New Mexico or beyond.
Yes. Thank you, Ophra, also for coordinating and for your questions and all the work that went into organizing. Roberta also, just everyone. I very much enjoyed your all the presentations and this opportunity to have this dialogue. Thank you.